Alright, so after you create a simple form, you actually want to submit it. So we have to create a sort of button called submit. Alright, so we just say input, we'll say type is equal to submit. So what this does is it creates a submit button. Alright, now there's another way to do this. We can also do that by using the button element. We say button and we say type is equal to submit. You can see that it creates another button over here, but it doesn't have any text in it yet. So for the button element, we actually have to say button. We have to say submit, sorry. We have to put the text in there. But for the input element, it just takes the type as the description for the button. Now you can see that both achieve the same result, but there is a slight difference between the input button, between this input button and this button element. The button element allows you to set images and HTML code as the content of the button, but the input element only accepts text as the content via the type attribute or the value attribute or a value attribute. So it's actually preferred to use the button element to set up buttons in a form. So first of all, we have a button that says, we have an input button that says submit, okay, and a submit button that says submit. But let's say we actually wanted to customize this button and we wanted to put some sort of image in it, alright? We wanted to put some image in it, so let's say we go inside button, okay, and let's say image, and we say the source is equal to source, we'll say images, SVGs, and we'll say account.svg, right? And if we save this, okay, if I save this now, you'll see that our button can take an image. And this is very different. You cannot do this using the input element, right? So we have an image tag, and we can also add some more HTML in there. So let's say span, and I'll say, let's say create account, right? Let's do that. Give it a space here. Save this. Yeah. Do you see? We cannot do this using the input element. Alright? Now a button can be used to do different kinds of things. A button can be used to do different kinds of things. If you set the type to submit, it'll submit the form. And if you set the type to reset, it will reset all the widgets that you've entered values into. Okay, and you can also set it as button, but what this will do is you can set up some special functionality using JavaScript, but that's not the scope of this tutorial. So we can see that in later tutorials, right? So let's see what this reset type does. We'll set up another button called reset. Okay, reset, and we'll call this reset. Great. So we have this first button which uses the input widget. We have the second button that's a submit type button that's using a button element, and because we're using a button element, we can also have an image inside it. And the last one is a button element with a type of reset. Now let me show you what the reset button does. Suppose I have Suraj in here and I say something at something.com, right? If I click reset, it resets everything in there, okay? But as you can see, since we haven't Now this didn't reset. The text area didn't reset because that is the default value. Alright? This is the default value. On the other hand, if I had in fact edited this, if I close that and then I reset, it would come back to the original value. Let's talk about these two attributes which you might end up using a lot: the placeholder attribute and the required attribute. Okay, so now the placeholder is a text that appears in the input element's content area when it's empty. And as you can see right now, the content area of the name label, this widget, is empty. Now a placeholder would be that grayed out text that comes in here. Now the intent of a placeholder is to show an example of the input, not an explanation, or avoid the placeholder whenever possible. Okay, if you can use just the label, alright? But use a placeholder to only display an example of the input that you expect from the user. Let's take an example of this name field itself. I shouldn't, for example, set up an attribute that says placeholder and say enter your name. I shouldn't be doing this because I shouldn't do this because this is just obvious that if there's a label over there that says name, I know I have to enter my name, right? So do not commit this mistake. What you ought to do is give an example of the input that you require. For example, something like first name, last name. This tells the user that yes, I want both your first name and last name. Okay, provide them in this format. I want the first name first and then the last name. I don't want the family name first and then your name. So this is an example of how you would use a placeholder. You can do the same thing for email. Let's say, for example, you accept only Gmail accounts. So it would be, and you want the person to enter a Gmail account, for example. Let's just say something at gmail.com. Alright, that's an example. The other attribute that I wanted to talk about was the required attribute. So when you have an element, when you have a widget that has this required attribute, and if that widget was not did not get any user input, then the form would not submit. All right, so let's say I have this, I have a name and an email and this description. All right, so let's say the description is not required. Okay, but I absolutely want a person's name and email before they click submit. All right, so right now let's see what happens. If I click submit, you can say the page isn't working. That's because, you know, this form submit page doesn't actually exist. Now this form submit page was the method, was the action of our form. Okay, but let's say we wanted to make something really cool. We didn't want the person to omit his name or email before while submitting the form. What we can do is we just write, suppose we didn't want his name to be omitted, we would say, we would go to the input for name and we would say required, and we save that. Now if we try to submit, you'll see that a pop-up appears saying please fill out this field. Right? We can do that. We can do the same thing even for the email, and we can say required. And now if we try to submit, you'll see that the first there's a pop-up that says name is required. Okay, so please fill out that name. Let's say I put a name. Okay, and now let's say I click submit. it still says, you know, email is required, so please fill out this field, right? Now, a couple of things you need to know about this required attribute. This required attribute is a type of attribute that you call Boolean. It's not like a regular attribute which has a property and then a value. It doesn't have that. This is called a Boolean attribute. Just simply mentioning it sets the value to true, and omitting it sets the value to false. Anyway, let's just have a recap of whatever we covered today. So we have a form. A form requires the user to input some data. The form data is sent to the server when the user clicks submit. A form consists of widgets, which is basically HTML elements, and types of HTML widgets are text fields, checkboxes, and widgets are paired with labels. Okay, we covered form, input, label, text area, and button, right? And this form has an action method which specifies where the form data should be sent. Method defines the type of HTTP request. The type attribute of an input specifies what type the widget will be, and the label specifies the label has an attribute called for, which will attach the widget to the input with the same ID. And the text area has two attributes called calls and rows that sets the width and height respectively of the text area, and a max length and min length, which defines the number of characters allowed. The button attribute has a submit, reset, and button attribute. And finally, we covered placeholder and required, right? Hope that was helpful. So this is the last look at the form. The form element has an action and a method. A label has a for attribute, which is for a widget. A widget is an input type in the first case, has an ID, which is the same as the for, which means this label is linked to the input, has a type, a placeholder, and another attribute called required. Then we have a text area with calls, rows, max length, and min length. The text area can be expanded, and it's actually used for multi-line user input. It can be expanded, the text area. Finally, we have an input method for buttons, which is we can set up buttons by using either the input element or the button element. But the advantage that the button element has over the input element is that you can set up images and additional HTML content as within the button. And the button has a submit type, a reset type, which are the most common types of button functionality. Anyways, we'll get into a little more advanced form elements in the next tutorial. I'll see you guys there. Take care.